This is a conversation with Françoise Baylis, a Canadian philosopher and trailblazing bioethicist. Across a 4-decade career, Professor Baylis has published bioethics beyond ivory tower theory into what she calls impact ethics, shaping real-world policy on assisted reproduction, stem cell science, and CRISPR gene editing. Today, we discuss the moral fault lines of the biotechnology revolution, from bespoke N of one cures to the specter of techno-eugenics. This is the Acc Podcast. Please enjoy.
I basically chose to do this at a time when the discipline or the area that we now call bioethics didn't exist. So that's the unusual part of my story. The very usual or traditional part of my story is I went to university not knowing what I wanted to do. And so basically I took one of everything. I took a course in philosophy. I took a course in Spanish. I took a course in psychology. And one of the other things that's not necessarily known to most people is that I'm actually Francophone and had done all of my education in French up until going to university. The university I went to was a bilingual university, and so I took the philosophy course in English. And I took some of my other courses in French. And one day I was complaining to another student that this is awful. They're talking about these old guys, Socrates, Plato. What do I care about that? And my friend said, oh, you should definitely get out of that course and take it in French. It's exciting in French. So I was bilingual. I signed out of the English course. I signed into the French course, and not a word of a lie. The very first class, the question the professor asked the students is whether or not masturbation was acceptable. And I am shocked that this is a topic for conversation in my class in philosophy. As the conversation continued, I understood that the reason this was being asked was because this was just after the world had the first IVF babies. And the only way to get access to sperm at that time was for men to masturbate. It's actually still the way we get access to sperm, but anyhow. And that's the Catholic Church at the time was very critical of the use of this technology for family making. And that's the context in which we were beginning to look at all the pieces of this technology and asking questions about the technology itself, but all the various steps leading up to it. I was hooked. I was excited. I understood philosophy differently now. I understood it to be permission to ask questions and to think for myself. And the reason I tell this story in detail is I really hope it inspires lots of young people and some of us older folks to think for ourselves, to pay attention to the world around us, and to really reflect on what it is we're being asked to accept. And maybe sometimes we need a critical lens on that. I think it was really just this feeling of being invited to think for myself. I think that's really what came to the fore. And that's why it mattered in one sense, this area of reproduction and health, because that really is the area that I've worked in my whole life. And I've paid particular attention to women and the ways in which women interact with the healthcare system, and not just in terms of reproduction. In fact, sometimes I get quite upset that we think that women are only uteruses and we only need to pay attention to their health when they're pregnant. When they are pregnant, we do need to pay particular attention to their health, partly because we assume that the body of a pregnant woman is the same as the body of a non-pregnant woman, and that's just not true. So I have a lot of interest in the human body. I have a lot of interest in women's health issues, a lot of interest in the women's bodies, but then also lots of my work has been about manipulating the human embryo. And in fact, my PhD thesis ended up being specifically on that question of whether we could legitimately treat the human embryo as a research subject. And again, you'd appreciate that that's very controversial from the perspective of different communities, different religious groups, etc.
Yeah, along that point, I find that question very interesting because it's very controversial. At what time point is it acceptable to do research on human embryos? And that's been a very controversial conversation. The UK's fertility regulator is saying that we should let laboratories culture human embryos up to 28 days instead of that long-term standing 14-day limit, arguing that this would unlock a lot of insights into miscarriage and birth defect prevention. So do you see, in your opinion, any circumstance by which pushing that boundary is sort of ethically defensible? And what safeguards do you think should be in place to maybe gradually get there if you think that should be a possibility?
So I think it's really important to understand the 14-day rule, where it comes from, and why it's currently under pressure. Under pressure, meaning that different communities of scientists, especially, would like to remove what is now seen to be as a barrier or a limit to research involving human embryos. The 14-day rule, if you will, gets instantiated with reference to stages of biological development. And you had work done both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, both of them ending up on the 14-day rule, but actually pointing to different parts of the biology. So in the United States, the emphasis was on 14 days because that's at which you can no longer have two embryos merge, if you will, and become one, or two embryos split and become identical twins. And so the idea was that must be an important phase in the development of the human, because us walking around humans, we can't split and recombine. So embryos can do this. And so this gets pointed to as an important stage of development that marks, okay, now it's really decided what it's going to be. It's going to be either one or two. In the United Kingdom, the emphasis was on what's called the primitive streak, which is part of the neurological development of the human. And we think of humans as being different from other animals by virtue of our intellectual rational capacities. Now, I'm not endorsing that view. I'm saying that that is a view that's out there. And so this is the precursor to the brain. And this is said to be a really important demarcation line. This typically happens at 15 days. And so the idea is we're going to go back and look at 14 days. So that's how we get the 14-day rule, which I think is a really important thing to be aware of. Now, what's happened is when that 14-day rule was introduced, it was kind of an easy thing for everybody to agree to. Why? Because we don't have the ability scientifically to go up to 14 days, never mind going on beyond 14 days. So everybody's really happy to sign. Why are you happy to sign on? Because you're basically signing on, I won't do what I actually can't do, right? So yeah, sure, I won't go beyond 14 days. It doesn't really mean anything because in terms of what scientists were capable of doing, they could do all that work within that time limit. What's happened now, which is why we're at this stage where people are pushing back, is they're saying, we actually have the capacity now to go beyond 14 days. We really want to go beyond 14 days. We want to tell you why that's scientifically important, all the things that we're going to learn. So you really need to take down this barrier. But what's happened is over time, that 14-day rule, which was articulated in the context of committee work, has now been entrenched in legislation around the world. Many, many countries use this. So you can't just change it on a dime, so to speak. You actually have to go and make legislative changes. And you're also going to have to build a consensus around this. What's really important to appreciate is if you take away the 14-day rule, what do you replace it with? And part of the criticism of the 14-day rule is that it's arbitrary. Well, why isn't every other number also going to be, in some sense, arbitrary? So, if you're going to pick 21 days, 28 days, once the time comes when you get to that stage where you'll say, oh, but that was just arbitrary. We need to move beyond that. And I think it's in that context that many people are having debate or discussion that if we take away this rule, what do we replace it with? In my own writing, what I've suggested, which is controversial, is that maybe the permissions ought to be project specific. So maybe when you actually apply to do research involving a human embryo, you have a goal or objective that you want to meet. You actually have to present that goal and objective, and you have to articulate really clearly the time frame you need for that project. So maybe some projects would only get permission up to 5 days. Maybe other projects would get permission up to 14 days. Maybe other projects would get permission up to 28 days. You have some problems, which is that you're giving authority to individual research ethics boards or research ethics committees, as opposed to having legislation nationally or internationally. And that's a challenge. But the flip side is then you're actually tying the research to a particular project, a particular developmental stage. And then what you're really doing is the harm benefit assessment. You're saying, look, the potential benefits of this research are so great that we're willing to incur these kinds of potential harms. And the harms are going to be obviously to the embryo, because typically the embryo is destroyed in the context of research. But the harms are also to different communities around the world that have different views and belief systems around the moral status of the developing human embryo. So how much do you need to push or take that on if your research doesn't require it? And what it also will stop is just everybody. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think it's really important to appreciate, where did we come from? Where are we today? And where we would end up, depending on what options we choose.
Yeah, I think with policies like this and with applications as complicated as research, where each project can be very, very different, I really love that it allows for that level of nuance, to the point where you can begin to make these suggestions that each project should have its own limit or its own acceptabilities. Unfortunately, that complexity is kind of lost when you're thinking about policy for abortion, right? Because there needs to be a hard fixed deadline, and I think you can draw a lot of parallels between these things because they're tackling the same underlying question. Please.
I think the thing that's interesting about what I'm proposing is it's not necessarily either or. You could combine them. You can have outer limit. You could pick, for the sake of argument, arbitrarily, as I said before, 21 days or 28 days, and there's reasons for picking either of those 2 days. But that should be the outer limit. That should be something that's entrenched in law that makes it really clear, because if there are going to be consequences to you violating the rules, you need to understand, where was that line? And it does need to be a bright line, and you need to know what are the consequences of stepping over that line. But you could have that in combination with authority given locally to say, look, the outside limit is 28 days, but no, you haven't given me an argument for this project needing to take the embryo to that maximum deadline. So there's a way in which you could do that. And I also believe that if you have that kind of approach, you're more likely to build trust with the broader public and the community, because you're showing yourself flexible, responsive, nuanced, attending to different belief systems. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody is always going to be happy or pleased or think you've got the right demarcation line, but at least it shows an attempt to not pretend that these are simple. So I guess I want to say, yes, I understand the benefit of a bright line. And certainly if there are going to be serious consequences for violating the rule, you need to know where that line is. But that doesn't mean that you can't still have nuance and respect for the complexity and the moral diversity that exists in the world.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Great point. I wanted to shift to sort of a different topic. Obviously, you're very famous for your commentary on CRISPR and germline editing, so I want to dive into that. I actually read your book, Altered Inheritance, and you make a really compelling argument that heritable genome editing shouldn't be treated as inevitable, that it's not just a scientific question, but a societal one as well. So I'm curious about what you think is most misunderstood about CRISPR and germline editing in the public conversation today, and why it's so important to be deliberate and slow down about these technologies. I've talked to a lot of experts in this area, George Church being one of them, and his view is that there's actually not an amazing use case for germline editing technology in the first place. And he believes that when you actually think about the pragmatics of it, regulatory is very slow for these types of technologies. So he's in support of it, but he doesn't actually think it'll be that useful for the applications that we've been sort of talking about. And so obviously, these are two very different perspectives. You are primarily a bioethicist, so you must have a different perspective on that. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. I know there's a lot of questions entangled in that, but if you just want to go ahead and get started.
Well, I think there's a lot of ways in which George Church and I would agree on what he has just said, which is that there's no real strong use case. So if you start from that premise, you can then say there's no important need right now, but scientists are good people. They want to develop knowledge. Knowledge is good. We should just let them do it. It'll take a long time. I can't really see any use for it right now, but we shouldn't stop blue sky science. That's one kind of approach. Another one is you could just be completely agnostic and say, well, I don't see any use for this, but so what? I'm working somewhere else and I'm interested in another part of the science. I don't fall in either of those two camps, largely because I'm worried about opportunity costs. So in my book, Altered Inheritance, I spend a lot of time talking about time, talent, and treasure. And basically what I'm saying is our time on this planet, whether we want to accept it or not, is finite. We're going to die. I know there's a lot of tech pros out there trying to do life extension. I'm not a fan of that whole project. But anyhow, I accept the fact that I'm mortal, you're mortal, we're all going to die. Part of what makes life valuable is, in fact, that aspect of human life, which is that it ends, it's finite. So we only have so much time in which to accomplish whatever we're going to accomplish individually and whatever we're going to try to accomplish as a community and as a society. So we need to pay attention to how we use our time. Quite frankly, this is complicated science, and there's only so many of us that can actually participate in this science project. Now, that doesn't mean that we haven't got a lot of really bright people on this planet, but if you're talking CRISPR technologies, it's a set number of scientists who have the capacity to do this work. Treasure. All science costs money. And so when I look at those three things, I want to say, okay, so how do we make sure that we're spending our time, talent, and treasure well? That to me means it's important to actually think about what you're investing in. And I think this is not an area of science right now that's worth investing in. Could I be persuaded otherwise? Yes. It's quite possible that somebody would come along and come up with a great argument about why this is absolutely critically important. And I would be willing to listen. And I would be willing to say, okay, I'm persuaded. I want to change my opinion. So I don't think there's anything wrong with changing your opinion over time, especially if you get presented with new information. But having said that, the arguments I've heard thus far make no sense to me. I can't endorse them. So I want to say that really clearly. It's factually accurate that there are some couples who want to become parents, who want to have healthy, genetically related children, and because of their own health situation, they are not capable of having healthy, genetically related children. They can't. None of the technologies we currently have available, either in the context of reproduction or in the context of, selective screening or pre-implantation genetic testing, termination, whatever, there is no scenario under which they can have that. Healthy, genetically related children. And the idea is that this technology would allow them to have that. That's factually true. So were this technology to be developed and become available, it would respond to that. The problem is many people call that a need. So they would finish the sentence by saying it would respond to that need. And that's where my work comes in. I reject the assumption that that's a need. From my point of view, it's a want. I believe that society has obligations to respond to people's needs. We don't have obligations to respond to people's wants. There are many things I want that I can't have, but there are things that I need, like housing, like food, like clean air. Those are things where society has obligations to think about responding to my claims that I have a need that needs to be addressed. Now, when I say this more technically, what I emphasize is we have a problem right now that I put under the banner of reification of the gene. So we are thinking that what's important about us are our genes. So that what's important about my relationship with my children is that they have some of my genes. And I'm saying that's crazy making. Number two, it completely undermines a lot of progress that we have made recently over the last 10, 20, 30 years to understand that there are many legitimate ways of making loving families. And they include things like adoption, other mothering, they include using donor gametes, they include blended families. If you keep saying the only thing that matters, and it's so important that I'm elevating it to a need, is that I have a genetic link to this child, you're undermining all those other very legitimate ways of making families. And I want to go further and say you're focusing on the wrong things. That's not what being a parent is about. Being a parent is about loving and caring for an individual that you're actually going to educate into becoming a citizen. And that doesn't have anything to do with genetic ties. And so I'm deeply committed to having people understand that that's not what matters. It's not about genetic ties. What really matters is actually this commitment to wanting to parent. And you can do that in all kinds of other ways.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I feel like whenever I think about germline or even just gene editing more generically for disease traits or for producing healthy life, I always view that as a positive, because if you have something that was going to have to suffer with a disease and you could prevent it, then that should be prevented. But I suppose that question is slightly different when thinking about germline editing, because the stage of that editing happens before the life itself. And so that raises the question of truly whether this is a need or a want. And hearing your perspective has made me reconsider the fact that there is this view that's holistically adopted by society that having our own children that are genetically similar to us is an important thing to have, when maybe we need to have this paradigm shift that this is not necessarily the right reason to be a parent, or this is not why you should necessarily be bringing life into this world and intentions there.
Well, I think what
I
it's
want.
doing is it's trying to take the focus off you, right? It's not about
Mhm.
you becoming a parent. It's about responsibilities that you're taking on. And I think this fits in this whole discourse about rights and responsibilities. And I think it's really sad if your parenting goal is all focused on your rights and not on your responsibilities. And I do think, to come back to your earlier remark, it really does matter that what we're talking about with heritable human genome editing is not looking at a member of our community, be they a fetus in utero, be they a newborn, be they a young teenager, be they an adult. We're not looking at one of those people and saying, you are in pain, you are suffering from this illness. If we had the capacity to fix you with chemistry, with surgery, with electricity, we would do that. But now we have this great new tool, and it's with genetics. That's one frame that fits within the way we understand our obligations to members of our community. That is not the project with heritable human genome editing. There is no member of our community who exists that we're trying to help. The person we're trying to help is these two people who wish to become parents to a very particular kind of child, not any child. It has to be this child. And I think, it's reasonable to understand why people might have a preference for healthy children. I say reasonable, maybe a preference, because some people would even contest that, and there's good grounds under which to contest that. But I think when you take that and you marry it with, this commitment to they have to have my genes or they're not my child, that's deeply problematic. And I think, as I said, I described our shift and moving away from that as progress. And I would be very leery to endorse things that undermine that progress in really significant ways. I do want to come back to the very beginning point, which is how do we spend our time, treasure, and talent? If I can, the other example that I give, and I describe this a little bit in the book, and it's science fiction. It says, look, I don't think that's a good reason to go ahead with heritable human genome editing. But what if you came along and you said to me, look, Françoise, this isn't about selfish parents or anything like that. This is about our species. And we're under threat right now because the planet is warming. There's water pollution, there's air pollution. I mean, very soon we're not going to be able to live on this planet. And so we really need to use heritable genome editing, because it's not only going to help us in the immediate future, but it's going to make sure that the next generation and the next generation and the next generation has been properly modified to live in these inhospitable circumstances. So a part of me would say, well, okay, I'm a little bit more interested in that argument because it's not individual and this person. It's really about the community and more broadly the species. So maybe I'm interested in that argument. But I then have two responses. Where do you imagine we're going to live? Do you think we're going to live still on this polluted planet? Or do you think we're going up into Mars or to some other spaceship? It matters because the genetic modifications you'd have to make are very different if you imagine we're living on this planet that's been completely compromised, or if you imagine we're getting off into outer space. So that's the first thing, really technical thing. And nobody's talking about that. But then the real Françoise Baylis is going to say, okay, I'm not playing games anymore. I'm saying, really? Why are we pissing in our sandbox? Really? Like, doesn't it make a whole lot more sense to just stop the things that we're doing that we know are wrecking our environment? I mean, we understand that our health is about gene environment interaction, right? It's not just our genetics that makes us healthy or unhealthy. It's our genes in our environment. And the environment is understood very broadly. But then why is it that we are out here allowing our environment to become completely inhospitable to our life form. And so my view would be, really, you are again choosing a biological response to a social, political, economic, cultural problem. What we should be doing is solving those problems using those tools, not fixing our biology to attend to, the crap that's happening.
Yeah, you talk a lot about our time, resources, energy, what we should actually be using that for. The technology for germline editing is not quite there yet, but I think a more maybe relevant technology to think about is just more generally gene therapy, ex vivo therapies that we've already seen come to market and have been used in N of one examples. I'm sure you heard of the physicians at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. That was a huge advancement. I was reading that the total manufacturing and development alone for that singular therapy was close to $800,000, and obviously,
no. Seriously, over millions.
yeah.
No, I mean, I think the thing to appreciate there is the following. This is not the first time that we've had a gene therapy that has come in with an exorbitant price tag. This is the first time that we've done this as what gets called bespoke science. This was developed for one patient. But before that, we've had work done most famously around sickle cell disease, which would be treating a larger population, et cetera. But the same idea. We're using genome editing in somatic cells. So these are body cells, not the germ cells. So just want to emphasize that, because the heritable genome editing, we're going into our reproductive cells. This is work done in somatic cells, trying to address the health needs of people, which is what, I said makes for a very important moral distinction. The problem with this, from my perspective, is we really need to seriously look at the question of costs. So it's not that I don't think we should respond to patients in need. I think we absolutely should. But I don't think we have a real therapeutic option if it comes with catastrophic pricing. And that's what we're looking at right now. You can't offer people a treatment and say, oh, yes, it's a couple of $1 million. I think that what I want to say really loudly and clearly is it doesn't matter if your health is paid for through a private healthcare system or a public healthcare system. No healthcare system can afford this kind of technology, because it becomes something that in theory any one of us could need. We're over 8 billion people on this planet. If only 1/10, 1/100th, 1/1000 of us needed genome editing technologies, how do we imagine paying for this? It will be available to the uber rich. There's no doubt about that. And those are typically the people that are also looking to use genome editing for their longevity projects and other kinds of crazy projects. But I think what's really important then is to put things in perspective. We don't want to walk away from the capacity to treat patients. We can't treat patients if we demand of them a transaction where they have to come up with millions of dollars. And so then we have to go back and say, where's the obligation? The obligation is on us, on society, to make those treatments affordable. And then comes the really interesting question, can we do that? If you think that you're going to bring down some of the costs and that will be sufficient, maybe. I have to admit, I have a fair bit of skepticism about that, because I'm not sure that that's the context in which the pricing thus far has happened. It seems to be very much more about things like, what can the market bear? Alternatively, it seems to be about ways in which we try to look at that one-time cost and compare that to a lifetime of treatment and a lifetime of life quality loss and inability to contribute to society, either in emotional, social, economic, cultural, or other ways. I want to make sure it's not just understood as a financial transaction, that I will become a productive member of society, but no, I'll become a social member of society and able to contribute in multiplicity of ways. So I understand that, but that's not going to get us to prices that are affordable, I don't think. And, I'll go back to something I said earlier. I could be proven wrong. And if I'm proven wrong, I'll be the first to stand up and say, wow, I don't know how you did it, but you've made this affordable. It's just that right now we're talking millions of dollars per patient, and that's not affordable. But maybe that's a challenge for the scientific community, and they will set themselves a goal. How can we make this much more affordable. So now we know how to do it. Now can we do it in a way that's affordable, which then means accessible, which then means equitable, which then means ethical. And I think that that's really important. But I'm happy to set that challenge for the scientific community to come in and say, okay, we've learned how to do it and we know how to do it. And now we're going to do it in a way that it will be more broadly accessible to people.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree. These therapies are extremely expensive. I think Casgevy is listed at 2 million or something like that. When I think about the pricing cost structure of these therapies, it's kind of like economies of scale, right? If we're targeting very rare diseases like sickle cell, there's just not a lot of patients out there.
I think the thing to appreciate there is there are not very many patients in the United States where people might be able to afford it. There are a lot of patients with sickle cell disease on the African continent, in the Middle East, in India. And I think what that does is it also highlights a really important issue in terms of understanding where the needs are and how that actually puts even more emphasis on making sure that these are affordable technologies. Now, having said that, it also becomes really complicated. If you don't even have access to more basic technologies that could significantly improve your quality of life, if we take sickle cell disease like hydroxyurea, if you don't even have access to that, do you think about this, or are we thinking that that's actually already would significantly improve quality of life? It's affordable, and we're not even doing the work there to make sure that those kinds of interventions are accessible to the people that would need them. So, I mean, the problem with healthcare, and I do think it is acute in the United States compared to other countries, because it's the only country that doesn't have an intellectual, emotional, ethical commitment to ensure that all of its citizens have access to healthcare, right? You have a patchwork that means that some people fall through the cracks. In many cases, if you're not going to provide basic healthcare to all of your citizens, how are you going to provide expensive, bespoke healthcare to all of your citizens? It's just not a project that seems reasonable. Got to get back to basics.
Yeah, I wish there were more incentive structures in place to make those markets more profitable for
Yeah, I
these
mean, but
large
the
companies.
interesting thing is to maybe, be willing to have a conversation about whether it's in the right frame of reference and whether in fact the market is what's distorting our capacity to do the right thing. If people, had a different frame of reference, and don't misunderstand me, I'm not speaking here against capitalism and all of its forms. I well understand that if you're a business person and you have taken risks and you've got to worry about making payroll and you've got all kinds of responsibilities that I sure don't want, I do think you should be rewarded for that the same way I'm rewarded for the job that I do. And it's a different job and it pays differently. So I'm not undermining any claim about the right in a capitalist system to make a profit. I am saying that we need to have conversations about what's a decent profit. And we don't have those conversations. And so, especially in the realm of healthcare, you can end up with pricing that's in no way connected to what's going on in the marketplace, right? So I think we need to be really attentive to that and be willing to accept that maybe it's a scenario whereby there's a different frame of reference for how we think this through. If I go back to this kind of what I think of as crazy pricing, I have been in conversations where people have offered up as solutions. Well, we'll spread the payment out over many years. $250,000 a year over 8 years is still a lot of money, right? And it's still going to bankrupt most people, not be accessible. What happens if it doesn't work? Oh, well, if it doesn't work, we'll give you back your money. And it's like, you give me back all my money? Oh, we'll give you back prorated money. You have had, success for 2 years. We thought it was going to last a lifetime or what have you. And my point in giving these examples, which I think are kind of crazy, is your health is not like buying a couch or a car that you're buying on installments or that you return if it's defective, et cetera. And so that's the context in which I worry about, do we have the wrong frame of reference? And therefore, are we drawing on the wrong tools when we're talking about healthcare? Healthcare is also different because you can't treat it like another commodity. I can't say, I'll buy the car next year, or I'll buy a used car instead of a Cadillac, or what have you. I mean, you're talking about my life, my health, my well-being. And so I am going to try and bend myself out of shape to get whatever I need to do, but at the risk of what? And those risks might not only be to me, but to the financial security of my whole family. So I think the issues are just more complicated in that regard. And I do think that right now, that's the biggest challenge. I think from an ethics point of view, it's not the only one, but it is about the biggest challenge right now because we're starting to see successes. We can anticipate more successes. And the question is, how do we get this from bench to bedside? Because right now, these successes, when they happen in the context of a clinical trial, the patient's typically not paying for that because we're still in that stage of knowledge production. Once you have knowledge production and you move out of the research environment into a therapeutic environment, you're in a completely different situation. And that's the problem I'm worried about. How do we get from these great ideas, these great successes to changed lives?
Yeah, my belief is that hopefully there will be technology in the next 10 years that can help scale these therapies to a point where they will be more affordable. But you said it just now, and it really struck me, like $250 for 8 years. That's my college tuition.
250,000.
Oh, yeah, sorry. 250,000 for 8 years is my college tuition multiplied by 8. So it's astounding. Like I don't know why I've never really thought of it that way.
Well, it also means you're in debt for the rest of your life. So whatever you've
Exactly.
secured in terms of length of life, what have you traded off in terms of quality of life?
Yeah.
I mean, what's it like to graduate and know that you're in debt for the next however many years after you've graduated? It is a weight. It's a weight that you carry. And if we're talking these kinds of sums, who's carrying that weight? And there's no individual that grows up expecting to be able to have an income where this kind of becomes an inconsequential expense. This is never, except for the uber rich, this is never going to be the equivalent of a cup of coffee. It's never going to be the equivalent of an annual vacation. It's not even necessarily going to be the equivalent of a house over a lifetime with a mortgage, right? It's really, I mean, there's no other way to put it than it is catastrophic. And so we need to think about, do you respond to a catastrophic illness with a solution that trades it for catastrophic debt? And I think that's not necessarily attending to the problem.
Yeah, really powerful line. I know we're coming up at the end here, so I just have one more question to ask you, if that's all right, to just close it out. If there's one rule, norm, or cultural mindset in the next decade to make biotechnology more equitable, what do you think it would be? And what is the first step that listeners tomorrow can help move us in that direction?
I think what matters for me is the starting point. And too often in a contemporary context, the starting point is really cool science. Wow, this is really cool. Look what we can do. And then we look around for a use. And I think we've kind of done that in this space. And I think what I'd rather see is a focus on what are the real problems that we have? And then when you're really clear on what those real problems are, then start looking, what technologies do we have, or what technologies do we need to develop to solve these real world problems? And if you think about our conversation starting with heritable human genome editing, I personally cannot believe that if we all sat down, and I could be in a small group, a large group, a nation, and we tried to say, what are the priorities? What are the challenges that we really, really need to invest in? And we need to invest our time, talent, and treasure. I just cannot believe that responding to the desires, the wants of a few couples to have healthy genetically related children would get on the list. I can't imagine that. And I want to put it in perspective. When I say very few, there are people, scientists who have done those calculations. And if I take as just one example, cystic fibrosis, their estimate is that you would be treating one couple every 15 years. Really? Really? I mean, how much money, how much time, how much talent are you going to invest in that project when we have people who just need clean water? We have people that need food. We have an increased housing crisis in many developed and developing countries. I mean, we have so many other problems that we can bring technology to. So I don't ever want to undermine the talent of the scientific community, and I don't want to undermine our capacity for problem solving. I think that when we do these things, there's awe, right? There's great awe that we've managed to accomplish this, and that happens, with the treatment of this young child, KJ, recently with somatic genome editing. These are wonderful things to celebrate. I'm not taking away from any of those things. I'm just asking for a different starting point in response to your question, that we really say, what are our big priorities and what should we be investing in? And that's a social question. It's an ethical question. It's not a science question. It sort of takes me back to a phrase that you may be familiar with where they say, whoever controls the question controls the answer. And it's ultimately whoever controls the priority setting in this case will control where the dollars get invested. And that's what matters. So a bit of a broad sweep. There's no specific answer, but it is a change in orientation. It's an ask to say, let's start at the beginning. And the beginning is, what are the problems we need to solve? Not what are the cool biotechs that we have or could have.
Yeah, I'm sure you have been seeing the news on really extravagant missions to solve de-extinction or solve problems that personally I can't really get behind, honestly. I still don't really understand the use case for some of these problems. But honestly, that framework that you've laid out on the table is useful not only from an ethical perspective, but even from a monetary perspective. A lot of these technologies start in an academic setting where maybe those thoughts of what it will be useful, what will affect the most number of people aren't as much of a, obviously they're considered, but they're not as much of a pressing thought as it would be maybe if you went straight into a commercial setting and you wanted to be profitable. So I think that framework can be applied to a lot of different contexts.